My fellow Americans and students in U.S. history, I hope that you're adapting as well as possible to these new online uh, options as part of our courses. I wrote something in a little Facebook post yesterday that this online teaching is turning out to be all the work plus more, and none of the enjoyment, because we actually, most of us, I think, enjoy dealing with the students. You help keep us young and at least somewhat enthused about what we're doing. Today's recording deals with the Great Crash and the onset of the Depression. In the 1928 election, of course, Coolidge did not run. He probably could have been easily reelected. But remember his famous brief word to the press, "I do not choose to run for president," in 1928. The Republicans chose Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce in Coolidge's cabinet and had been in Harding's cabinet. Hoover was thought of as a problem solver. In World War I, he had been the food commissioner who was in charge of seeing that we had enough food produced for the war effort. And in the 1920s, there was a severe flooding situation in the southern Mississippi Valley, and as Commerce Secretary, he led the way for relief on that, and many people thought he had done a good job. So I think even if many Americans had been told that a great crisis was coming, they might have thought Hoover was the man they wanted. Hoover was opposed by the Democrat Alfred E. Smith, a New York City politician who had been a part of the Tammany Hall machine, but then turned against it. Smith was the first Roman Catholic nominated by a major party. Of course, the only Roman Catholic that has been elected to office up to this point is John F. Kennedy in 1960. Even though Hoover won pretty handily in that election, Smith helped to start the building of a coalition that helped the Democrats probably still clear up to today in many ways. Traditionally, a lot of big cities had voted the way big business went with Republicans. Smith began the trend of big cities often voting Democratic, and especially the urban ethnic voters, the European recent immigrants like Italians, Poles, Czechs, blacks where they were able to vote. This combined with the traditional strength the Democrats had in the solid South gave the Democrats a pretty strong base to grow from. This chart shows you the stock market ups and downs before the Great Crash on Tuesday, December 29, 1929. Some terms that you need to know, they're described in the lecture notes. Buying on speculation. People were buying stock with the hope that they would just quickly turn around and resell it. They were not aiming at holding it for long-term returns. Many people were buying on margin, which means buying on credit. And if the price of the stock started to decline, whoever had loaned you the money might make a margin call, meaning you'd have to put up the rest of what you had borrowed, or they would sell the stock to cover their losses. A bull market is when the market continues to go up, a strong stock market that is rising in value. The bear market is what we're seeing right now with the coronavirus, large-scale losses in the stock market, A bear market is when the price of stocks is trending down. On October 29, 1929, you had the Great Crash. And it is important to note this is not the cause of the Depression. As I say in the notes that I have posted for you, it is more like this is the first clear symptom that the economy is in trouble. There were newspaper headlines throughout the country about the dramatic losses. One thing that I've found kind of interesting is I haven't been able to find any headline from the New York Times, which, since it's centered in New York, where the stock market is, you would think they would have covered this pretty heavily. The margin calls sometimes led to people committing suicide, jumping out of high-rise buildings in New York. This really was not as common as popular culture seems to suggest, but it did happen. There was massive unemployment during the Depression. At its height, it was basically about a fourth of the population was unemployed. However, we don't normally think of people in the military as just employees, and most farmers were self-employed. So if you look at just the non-farm civilian labor force, unemployment got to about 37% at the worst of the Depression, which was the months from November 1932 to March 1933. This is an iconic image from the Depression. Iconic means it's something that's just kind of come to symbolize the time. This is a photograph called Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange, who worked for the Farm Security Administration, a federal agency trying to preserve jobs in farming. Now, Hoover's responses to the Depression were kind of limited, in part because he did not believe we could use deficit spending. He believed, like many experts did, that the stock market troubles could be quarantined from the rest of the economy, which, of course, often the stock market kind of illustrates what the economy is doing. Sometimes it doesn't, however. Sometimes it's the stock market can be doing well when the economy is not overall doing too well. And in this case, the stock market was doing badly, and the truth was the economy was doing badly as well. Now, in the 1932 election, Hoover was in trouble, of course. He had only been in office he had only been in office a few months when the Great Crash hit and the Depression started, but people blamed him for it. And so this opened the door for the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, governor of New York, who had had some important success on the local level dealing with the Depression, to win a dramatic victory. This map shows you the Electoral College vote. Now, a lot of the New Deal agencies, I'm not going to go through so much on this slide or on this recording, but many of them came to be known as alphabet agencies because they were known just by their initials. The Agricultural Adjustment Act that tried to help farmers by paying them to reduce production. This is one example of an alphabet agency. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which put people to work doing work on public land for conservation and beautification efforts. This is another alphabet agency. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, the men lived in almost military style discipline in camps, and they not only were getting a job, but in some cases were getting some vocational training that would help them in the long run. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the AAA was, Roosevelt considered it was the heart of the New Deal as far as dealing with agriculture. The National Industrial Recovery Act was the heart of the New Deal for industry. Businesses that were cooperating with the National Recovery Administration, which is the organization that the NIRA set up, showed a blue flag to show that they were cooperating with this government program. Now, I'm not going to have a great deal of time here. I'm trying to keep these broadcasts relatively short, but you can go through the notes on your own looking at the reactions to the New Deal. There was some political opposition by men like Father Charles Coughlin, Dr. Francis Townsend, and Huey Long, a senator from Louisiana, who came out of a political machine that controlled politics in Louisiana. The Long machine continued clear up into about the 1960s or so to have considerable political power in Louisiana. More important to Roosevelt than those political challenges was what the Supreme Court did. And as it says on this slide here, you don't need to worry about these too much, but in 3 cases, the Supreme Court basically gutted the AAA and the National Industrial Recovery Act. This led Roosevelt, as he approached re-election, to push a new series of proposals that became known as the Second New Deal. One of the most important and enduring of these was the Social Security Act, which was passed in part because Roosevelt wanted to take this issue away from Francis Townsend, who was promoting the old age revolving pension fund. If you look at the details of Social Security, it did a lot of the things, although on a much smaller scale, similar to what Townsend had been talking about. As it says on the bottom of this slide, this will almost certainly be on the final. What was the impact of the major impact of the New Deal? The New Deal represented an expansion of the government's role in the economy and in the everyday life of the people. The New Deal had an impact. It helped with the economic crisis. Would it have solved it if the war didn't come? We don't know that, obviously. But it really was the war that ended the Depression. We quickly go to declining unemployment, to full employment, and at the height of the war, job shortages in some critical job areas. So as I've said before in class, all we are saying is give war a chance. Good night and good luck.